Hi, good morning, afternoon, everyone. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Beth Graybaugh. I am with Veterans in Agriculture. Today's program is made possible because of a grant from the North Central Extension Risk Education and USDA. If you have any questions during the program, just put it in the chat or wait till the end, and we will take them then. Today, we are joined by Susan Kuzak. Susan is the Division Director for the Soil Conservation and Water Quality for IDALS. And for those of you that don't know, IDALS is the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. So welcome, Susan.
Thanks, Barb. Or Beth, sorry. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I guess now that it's noon. Thank you for having me here. I always love any opportunity I get to get out and talk about soil conservation and water quality and all the efforts that we have going on here at the department. Like she mentioned, my name is Susan Kozak. I'm with the Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. We use a lot of acronyms in our world, I feel like, so that is one of them. We refer to ourselves as IDALS a lot, just like the Iowa DNR is the DNR, or Department of Natural Resources gets referred to as DNR. In our division of soil conservation and water quality, we have 3 different bureaus that do some various different work all around our natural resources in Iowa. The first one, the bureau that I kind of came up through, is our Mines and Minerals Bureau. Not very many people know that we have this function at the department, but we do have oversight of all of the mineral mining across the state of Iowa. So that includes limestone, sand and gravel, gypsum, and clay. And so they license and register all of those sites in Iowa. And they also have a program that reclaims abandoned coal mines, primarily down in southeast Iowa. And that is a federally funded program that we have responsibility for here in our division. The next bureau is our Field Services Bureau, and that's the one that's been traditionally working on soil conservation efforts, which you might be more familiar with here in Iowa. And then our third bureau is the Water Resources Bureau, and they work on drainage well closures, they work on wetlands, and now some other edge of field water quality practices that we'll discuss a little bit. Between the 3 bureaus, we have over 200 people in our division working across the state. We have staff that are in every county in Iowa, and this is one thing that's kind of confusing, but our state IDAL staff are located in the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture offices, typically with NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service staff, and a lot of times also Conservation District of Iowa staff or Soil and Water Conservation District staff. So multiple different entities of staff all in one office. So we really encourage you, if you have conservation questions, starting at that local USDA NRCS office in your county, that's going to be the best bet to get some assistance. A lot of times we have a lot of acronyms, like I mentioned, that we use for our different programs, and we have a lot of different funding sources that we kind of hodgepodge together. And so going in and getting the advice from the local technical staff or the conservation assistant that usually is at the front desk, they can get you started and pointed in the right direction of if a federal program or a state program is the better fit for your resource concern on your land. A lot of times we'll also start with some planning that looks at your whole farm, your whole operation, and what are the options that might be good fits on your land to put a practice in to help the environment and help your farm be more productive. To start out with, to talk about our traditional cost share programs or soil conservation programs, a lot of times I think about those as our terraces and grade stabilization ponds, or cover crops, and no-till incentives can fit into that traditional cost share for soil conservation. We've been focused on these kind of practices in Iowa. Well, the country started thinking about them based on the Dust Bowl and all of the erosion that you saw from that event. It started people talking about what should we be doing for conservation across the United States. And so a lot of conservation districts And programs started then after the Dust Bowl and into the 1940s, the 50s. You really see these efforts growing. And in 1973, the state of Iowa started funding for soil conservation permanently and has had that in the budget every year since. So it's been a focus here for almost 50 years in Iowa. As I mentioned, it typically includes some of those structures that you see across the landscape like terraces, but it can also include windbreaks, pollinator habitat, rotational grazing programs, and one that maybe doesn't get talked about as much, but we're trying to focus on are grassed waterways, where maybe you have a creek or some sort of waterway that goes across your farm or beside your farm. Putting some sort of grassed buffer by that creek can have many benefits for wildlife and water quality and soil erosion and soil health. Our what we call the Iowa Financial Incentive Program, or cost share, that program sees strong demand every year across the state, with many of our applicants waiting over 2 years, or an average of 2 years, to receive that financial assistance. Just for a snapshot of the numbers for that program, in fiscal year 21, which was last year, we provided financial assistance for over 1,000 practices with cost share, and we had $6.5 million of state funding that went out for those practices. And that was matched by farmer contributions of over $8 million. So it is a cost share program based on which funding source we're using, where you're located. Maybe if you're in a priority watershed, it may vary, but typically cost share is 75% state funding and then 25% from the farmer. So there are farmer contributions going into these practices. Like I said, it can vary depending on where you're located or what program you're under. So sometimes it could be limited to 50%. And then sometimes lately on some of our higher priority practices, we've been getting up to 100% where the state covers the entire cost and the farmer may not have to contribute anything on those. But that's kind of rare right now based on funding sources. More than 85% of the cost share assistance last year went to implement permanent structural practices on the ground. And that's important to me when you think about these practices, like a terrace or a grade stabilization pond. Those are going to be there year after year to do their job of soil erosion prevention and soil health benefits. Whereas cover crops or no-till incentives, those are something we're going to pay for annually. So we're not going to get the long-term benefits from our dollars like we do from those structural practices that stay on the ground and across the landscape. Not saying that those others aren't important, but I like those long-term practices where I pay once and we get the long-term benefits. Cover crops are another big priority that we've been focusing on here at the department. They have a lot of soil health benefits and water quality benefits. So it kind of gets us double duty for our money. And there is cost share available for cover crops in many different ways in Iowa. So I would encourage you to, again, if you had questions on that, reach out to your local office because they're going to be able to steer you toward either a federal EQIP program that might be best or the state cost share. Or now through USDA, there are some cover crop insurance discount benefits that you can get $5 off per acre off of your insurance if you have crop insurance and plant cover crops. So lots of different opportunities to explore there. In fiscal year 21, so previous year, over 550,000 acres of cover crops were obligated with state cost share funding, and over 2 million acres were planted in the state with all the different funding sources combined. So that's really exciting to see some progress made on cover crops. We're a long way from our goals on those, but we have been seeing a lot of increased interest in cover crops, and that's great to see. Especially right now, this is the great time to be driving across the state of Iowa and seeing those cover crops in place, doing their job right now until the crops get planted and start coming up and hold the soil in place. For water quality, so a lot of times I think traditional soil conservation, and then I think water quality also. Not that they don't go hand in hand and have benefits together, but that's how our kind of programs and bureaus are set up. So we also have some newer efforts that we've been focusing on here in Iowa in maybe the last 10 to 15 years. And that's based on what we call the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. You may have heard about that in the news. And it's kind of an area in the Gulf of Mexico where the oxygen is so low that a lot of life cannot be sustained. So it's a very big concern for the fishermen and people down in the Gulf. And it's based on nutrients coming down that Mississippi River from states like Iowa and Illinois and Minnesota. And so we have in Iowa developed what we call the nutrient reduction strategy. And that helps us focus our efforts in with some new water quality dedicated funding. And we target that at priority watersheds that have been identified through a scientific project with Iowa State University, saying these are the areas that we should focus our efforts on to get the most bang for our buck, basically, for our water quality dollars to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus across the state and what is leaving into the Mississippi River. So we, in just the last few years, have received dedicated funding from the state of Iowa for this effort. We have $15 million coming in through an infrastructure fund. Plus, we have had some traditional water quality money for the last 10 or so years. So combined, we have almost $30 million each year going to these water quality efforts. And that's kind of what we've been saying for a while now, that we need that dedicated funding to be able to reach our goals. One thing that we've been doing because of this increase in funding is ramping up our efforts dramatically. As I mentioned, our Water Resources Bureau has been putting in some wetlands for many years. Over the last 15 to 20 years, it's taken us just about that time to get 100 wetlands on the ground that are nutrient removal wetlands. And now that we have other funding sources that we can dedicate, we have over 40 to 50 projects in the hopper right now that should be constructed in the next year. That's a huge change of pace from the 3 to 5 wetlands that we have been building each year. We've also been talking about edge of field practices. So one of those is those nutrient removal wetlands. But the other 2 practices or 3 practices when we talk about edge of field is typically the saturated buffer, bioreactors, and oxbows. So if you think about an oxbow is, I think, the easiest one to picture, that typically you might have historically a river that flowed through an area and then a little loop gets cut off and the river starts flowing more straight. And so that little loop that gets cut off, that's called an oxbow. And if we can restore those oxbows, then you get some nutrient removal benefits, and it's really good for habitat and the environment. So that's one practice that we've been trying to focus on. And then the other 2, saturated buffers and bioreactors, are also edge of field practices. A saturated buffer would be where, like, you have tile that's going across a farm field and you have a creek here. So they all go right into the creek. If you can put a tile in and intercept that water prior to the creek, then you get a lot of nutrient removal benefits, and that farm field still has the drainage benefits that it needs from the tile removal. A saturated buffer is similar, but it only intercepts one tile line. And it's about, if you can picture an excavation about the size of a semi-truck, where you fill that in with wood chips and then hook the tile line up through the 2 ends. Those wood chips do their job to help with nitrogen removal, and you have cleaner water coming out, hopefully, than it came in from that original tile line. And then it just goes on down the tile and out to the creek, but you've received some really good water quality benefits from that bioreactor. That one has a very small footprint compared to a wetland. So sometimes that fits in the landscape better than a wetland might. Or a saturated buffer may not always work based on what your stream bank looks like. So a bioreactor might be the better choice depending on the conditions in your farm field. So that's where a staff person coming out and looking at your operation and seeing what the conditions are can really help you decide what the best practice might be for your operation. In fiscal year 21, we put in over 47 saturated buffers and 18 bioreactors. And this year, with all the projects that we have going on, we're probably going to triple that pace. So I love seeing us really accelerate our efforts, because the more of these practices that we can get on the landscape, the better, the closer we get to those nutrient removal and nutrient reduction strategy goals. Another project or practice that we've been focusing on here in the last couple of years, we had a pilot project to install grade stabilization structures down in southern Iowa, where maybe some of these the wetlands, other practices may not fit in their landscape because it's a little more rolling. But a grade stabilization structure, which is kind of a pond that has a lot of nutrient removal benefits, they might fit better down in southern Iowa. So we've been focusing down there on the ag land drainage and trying to capture those nutrients coming off of the landscape. So that's another practice that we've been really trying to promote and sell. With our significant uptick in available programs and funding for water quality practices, we get a lot of questions on how can people understand these programs a little better, or what resources are out there to help them. And so we have been adding some focused staff in our priority watersheds across Iowa, so that there's a technical person there that is probably local to you or within a few counties of you to be able to come out and answer these questions. And so I encourage you, you could look at our website at the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship under water quality. You can find some staff resources there. We also have a Clean Water Iowa website that can have some good information on these practices that I've been describing in a little more detail to tell you what these are. But again, going to that local office that you work with for NRCS and USDA, they're going to have our state staff in there too. And if you ask about these kind of projects, they're going to point you to the right staff person. As I said, we want to increase our efforts. So the more we can do some outreach to any and all different groups, we really appreciate this opportunity. We want to go from 5 to 10 wetlands being constructed on the ground every year to 30 wetlands getting on the ground every year. So a big change in pace. And we also, I mentioned those saturated buffers and bioreactors. We've been trying to look at a different way to get those installed across the landscape, where instead of just doing one practice at a time with one landowner, we might bundle several of them together. And maybe one landowner has 5 different practices on their land, or we have 5 landowners that we do 15 practices together. And it's one contractor that comes out and does the work. So it's much more efficient for contracting and much more efficient for the landowners than not having to go in and sign a ton of paperwork. So that's a new idea that we've been exploring and has been pretty popular. So you might hear about batch and build projects. And if somebody approaches you, that's what they're trying to do, is just do these saturated buffers and bioreactors or edge of field practices in a much more efficient way. I think one of the bottom line takeaways of all our efforts is that we want more. We want more soil conservation, soil health, and water quality practices across the state. We want more partners and more farmers to be involved and aware of our efforts. At IDALS, we're pushing really hard to get this awareness out there and have more staff out there to help people to build our efforts. And so we appreciate any opportunity to have these conversations. So I encourage you, if you're interested in any of these practices, we would love to talk to you and see what fits on your landscape. My contact information can be made available, and I'm happy to always point you in the right direction. And I want to wrap up by thanking everyone that may be tuning in for their service. Our veterans and our military are very important to us and our country, and so thank you for your service.
Thank you, Susan. That's some great information. I love hearing about all the things that are being done on the land in Iowa and the progress that we are making. So I have one question. You talked about all the different bureaus or all the different agencies that all have kind of a part of this mission. And you talked about going to your offices. So when an individual goes to their local service provider, how do they, you talked about federal funds and state funds. Do you pick one or the other? Can you do combinations of all of the different fundings? What happens?
Sure. It is really confusing. And so I always encourage people, if you're going to that local USDA office, a lot of times you're going to have NRCS on one side and FSA on one side. And if you're looking at these conservation programs, a lot of times I will go to that NRCS side because that's where you're going to find multiple different entities. A lot of times we talk about it as a three-legged stool in Iowa, where you have the federal, the state, and the local as each one, those legs on the stool. And if you don't have all three of us working together, it's probably going to fall over and not work very well. So that's why going into that office and talking to the conservation assistant, who's probably a state employee, they're going to be able to point you to whatever practice is the best for you, whether it's federal or state. They should be pretty knowledgeable in all the programs. And then, like you said, a lot of times you can combine some of the federal funding with state funding, depending on the practice that you're trying to do. And so that's where I'm always like, it gets so complicated and confusing. Just go talk to that professional because they should be able to help you. And now some of the co-ops have some conservation agronomists, and they can be a great resource too to get you started. They understand the offices and our language a little bit more sometimes. And so, but since they're at maybe your local co-op, they're a little bit more of a friendly face to some of our producers. And so they like to start there. But
so that local office is going to find you the best deal for what is needed on your farm.
Yep, we kind of feel like it's getting more complicated as we get more different federal grants in that can be used for specific places or specific ways. It is so confusing. I can't remember all of them myself. And so we don't want the landowners or producers to have to worry about those details. We just want you to come in and think about some conservation, and we'll help figure out the details for you.
Well, that sounds great. You know, and it's nice to know that everybody's working together for that same common goal, and then also to make it less confusing for that producer. So, well, I'm going to ask if anybody has any other questions or comments that they would like to make at this time. Otherwise, we'll I thank Susan for her time today and providing an overview of all the different programs that we have available in Iowa. I think we're very lucky for all the support that we have federally, at the state level, and locally.
Yeah, we're very lucky, and we're a lot different here in Iowa with our nutrient reduction strategy that we have dedicated state funding on top of our federal funds that are coming in. Very lucky in the state of Iowa that we have a lot going for us right now in the conservation world.
Okay, well, with that, again, I thank Susan and for speaking to us today, and everybody that is attended. So everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.